Welcome to the Physician Associate Podcast.
Hello, welcome to this episode of the Physician Associate Podcast. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. Lewis Potter, who is the founder of Geeky Medics. If you've done an OSCE any time in the last 10 years, you probably have used Geeky Medics as a website and a GP trainee. Welcome to the show, Lewis.
Thanks, James. Nice to be here.
Thank you on behalf of generations of PA students and other healthcare professionals for launching your website, because it's proved invaluable to me and I'm sure many others.
Oh, wow. That's so nice of you to say, James. Thanks. That's also makes me feel quite old when you start mentioning generations. You
want to introduce yourself? Tell us about where you trained as a doctor and where you came up with the idea for Geeky Medics.
Yeah, sure. So I trained as, so I was a medical student in Newcastle at Newcastle University between 2007, 2012. And then I graduated and started foundation program and stuck around in Newcastle. And it was sort of in the years between the end of medical school and the beginning of foundations. It was that period where I started Geeky Medics. So it's 12 years next week. So basically, I was a fourth year medical student and trying to prepare for OSCEs and learn clinical skills stuff. And I was also obviously just a massive nerd. So I was tinkering with website-y stuff and I'd launched a few blogs that no one had read, and no one was on Twitter back then, so no one was following my updates of what I'd eaten for lunch, etc. So I kind of was looking for an excuse for a website, and I also had a need to revise for my exams. And there were websites for medical education back then, but there wasn't anything that was particularly great. In particular, there was no OSCE guides or videos available for free. So there was, I think, one or two companies offering some sort of paid videos. And I did actually buy access to them with a friend, with Andy, actually, who you all, I'm sure, know from the videos. And
the eternal final year medical student star of your OSCE videos.
I think we went halves on 20 quid each to get access to these OSCE videos, and we were massively disappointed. So it literally had timed access. I think you were only allowed to watch so many minutes, and then it would lock again and you'd have to pay again. And the actual content was pretty poor. So the video quality was really poor. It was like a random camera in one corner of a room, and then an examiner in the other corner of the room, and then the patient behind them. The mic was on the camera. So it was just altogether terrible production quality. And I was interested in video production because at school I was in drama club. And although I couldn't act, I was sort of shooed towards being in production, which was nice of them to not say I was a bad actor, but that definitely was the reason. And so I was interested in video editing because of that. That was on tape, believe it or not. But I was intrigued by that and enjoyed it, and it sort of played around with it. And it kind of also went along with my interest in tech. So when this situation arose where we looked at what was, essentially the market leader at the time in OSCE resources, I felt like we could easily do something better than what they'd done and just do it for free. At that time, seems hard to believe, but YouTube was still fairly small compared to today. And they just enabled HD video. So HD video was the future. So I decided that it would be cool to buy a HD camera. So I sort of saved up my birthday money, and I'd been working at B&Q, so I had some money saved up from that. And so I bought a camera and a mic and a cheap tripod. And I convinced Andy and Colin to feature in the first two videos, which was cardio and respiratory exam. And we just sort of flipped them around. One played the patient, one played the doctor, and then we flipped it. And it was a bit of a leap of faith for them. I remember they were quite anxious about it because they had to, have their top off on camera. YouTube at the time was viewed almost as unprofessional, just generally. No one was video, blogging on it or anything like that. But even just being involved with YouTube at the time, it was kind of seen as a no-no. So there was a bit of anxiety from Colin and Andrew and myself that we might get in trouble for doing this. It seems a bit silly, it's not like we were doing prank videos, we were doing cardiovascular exam. But they took that kind of leap of faith and agreed to be in the video. So we shot those videos and I edited them together. And I had to sort of figure out how to put a website up as well. So I'd done a few blogs, which I sort of cut my teeth on that and figured it out. So I launched like I bought like server space, because at the time you kind of had to do that. You couldn't just like sort of log in and do it. And I used WordPress, which some people might be aware of. And so I launched the website, a few guides with a few videos. And I also realized quite quickly when I launched the website that you kind of need graphics for a website. Otherwise it looks, pretty bare bones and it's all just text. I wanted to use some like quite swish looking professional stuff, but it was all like copyrighted, or it needed like, I didn't really understand how licensing worked, and I was just a bit anxious about it all. So I decided that I would create some myself, because I liked pixel art, this kind of old video game style artwork. So I'd been doing that as like a little side project anyway. So I thought, well, I'll create like a little pixelated heart and lungs or whatever. And then obviously if this takes off or anyone uses it, then we'll switch that out for some professional looking stuff. But that ended up becoming part of the brand almost, by chance. And the URL itself, Geeky Medics, I'd purchased it to do a podcast bizarrely back then. Podcasts had just launched and they were brand new. And I thought maybe they had, there was something there. So the idea was to have a few geeky medics chatting about geeky topics. That was the whole reason. And I did one episode of that and it was terrible. So I'd given up on that months before, but I still had like another 10 months in the URL. So I decided to reuse it for this project. So that's the sort of, those factors came together and suddenly we had a website with a few videos and a few guides. Naively, I thought they would be popular straight away, because I thought, well, there's nothing for free, basically. We've put loads of effort into this. It's HD, but there was no interest basically for months. Not even my mum was putting in the effort to go and watch it. So I obviously being an introvert, I went to like medical student forums and decided I needed to do some form of marketing. So like I posted on a few forums and, hey, there's this website. And I think like after a few weeks, one person replied and said, oh, like this looks quite good. Like I'll spread the word. And I don't think there was any other replies. But then basically, because I really enjoyed filming the videos and I enjoyed like making the website look nice and making it better. So I just kind of kept doing it, even though no one was really watching at that point. And then slowly but surely, people in my year group started to use it. And then it just spread from there. So it definitely wasn't anything to do with me or my marketing prowess or anything like that. I presume it spread via word of mouth. And then eventually started ranking in Google. So when someone would search, cardiovascular exam, it would show up. And I guess that got us more exposure. And then the rest is kind of history. So we went from that 12 years ago, and now we do, we've had over 250 million views, from a, internet global audience. So it's my mind is blown, over 5 million views a month. So yeah, that's a very compressed history of it. And it was, it came out of just being a project and something fun into something now that I'm finally able to, do a few days a week as a sort of job. So I'm delighted, because I still love working on it. There's few things that I still like doing that I liked doing 12 years ago, but Geeky Medics just is one of them. So yeah, and most of that is because of like the community and like getting to email people and getting to work with like really, really great educators and contributors, etc. So I feel really lucky to be able to still work on it, and I hope long may it continue. I'd be happy if I'm still doing this in 30 years. So fingers crossed.
Oh, brilliant. That's amazing. And from a humble beginnings to the sort of behemoth that it has turned into, I bet you weren't expecting that when you were a student.
Definitely not. Definitely not.
There's a strong sort of flair in you coming across of sort of liking innovation and being a bit innovative, seeing something new. Is that something that you've always had? Was that developed through university or?
Yeah, I think so. I've been interested in like technology and that sort of intersection where it's like technology meets art and then I guess meets education. And those were like my three, I guess, areas of interest. And Geeky Medics is a bit of a culmination of those things that I like doing. So video production, website-y stuff, apps and whatnot. So I think I always have had some degree of interest in those things. And, before Geeky Medics was my third YouTube channel, my first one was me reviewing like laptops and like MP3 players, which, people were just really mean in the comments. So I kind of gave up on that. And that's why I stayed behind the camera ever since. So there was loads of things that didn't work out. Actually, Geeky Medics was just in the long run. But I think often being interested in a few different areas like that is where you start seeing opportunities that like overlap. So, I think if you literally just have like one thing that you're into, often all of those opportunities in that area are quite obvious to anyone else who's in that area. But as you start having multiple things, so say you like a bit of video production and you also like education, and maybe you like, you're into your website stuff. And then suddenly like the Venn diagram, that intersection point, there's much less like sort of competition for ideas in that space. And that's often where I think you spot new opportunities And I mean, that's just my synopsis of it, my synthesis of what I think happened. So I definitely always advise people to just dabble and play with these different areas of their life that they'll call hobbies or just interests. And often you'll see things where there's a bit of an overlap.
I think for me, the Physician Associate podcast was born out of a sort of interest in some geeky tech audio stuff and sort of wanting to promote my profession, show off what PAs can do. So definitely.
Exactly. And not all PAs would do, not all audio people are going to do that, because they're not going to start talking about PA. And PA people who don't really like tech stuff or audio probably aren't going to start a podcast. So I guess, yeah, it's a great example of it.
It was prescient as well, I think, that you chose the name Geeky Medics. It sort of encompasses everybody then, doesn't it? It's paramedics, it's nurses, it's PAs, it's doctors, it's the whole community.
Yeah, I wish I could take credit that was, lots of foresight, but really it was the ill-fated podcast. But yeah, I'm glad that I did that, because I guess it's hard when you start, because I obviously I wouldn't have been like, oh, will there be a community of people? Like, I was like, oh, maybe like some people in my year group will find it helpful. Because at the time we were all just like emailing Word documents to each other. That was like the height of the tech, revision strategy. But yeah, I'm glad that I did that, because it does represent it. I mean, ultimately, Geeky Medics, I'm working on it, but really it's all, the contributors and the users and everyone else, really. And that's why, to be honest, I've largely not, tried to shove my face in front of a camera, and always, I filmed every video, but never tried to feature in them, except when needles go into places and I don't want to put, our contributors through it. So my wrist has been used many times for the ABG video and all those kinds of things. Just so those are my only cameos in those videos. But I think often that's quite important, is to be able to take a step back. And I just wanted to create a place for other people to do stuff as well, because that's intellectually more interesting to me.
So literally blood and probably sweat and tears have gone into building Geeky Medics. I'm sure it's gone on to be very useful to many people to learn ABGs and down the line.
Yeah, you know what? Commitment, right? Commitment.
One of the things you said was very interesting to me about YouTube and how that was almost seen as unprofessional to be on YouTube as a medical student back when you were starting Geeky Medics. It's a very different world now with social media, in my opinion. There's lots of PAs who are on social media and Instagram, and I use social media to promote the podcast. Are there any pitfalls that you've come across?
Yeah, I think it's one of these, massive cultural shift that has happened in the space of 10 years. 10 years ago, it was really just, the really geeky people on there. Twitter was, I remember Paris Hilton joining as like the first popular person. And, the biggest people on there at the time were all like technology founders, and there was like no one else. But yeah, I think with that shift, the norm now is to be on these platforms and to share and to, be quite public. And I think there's still a long way to go before we figure it all out completely. Obviously, the GMC has put in some degree of, social media guidance in terms of what to say and what not to say. That's clearly not followed most of the time, because I think they say you basically can't even have like an anonymous account on social media. I think that's one of the things they say. I generally try and keep a pretty low profile on social media for that reason, because I'm always kind of worried of like saying something that's, causes offense. Not that I'm particularly, I don't offend people regularly or anything, but yeah, I've taken quite a cautious approach to it. It's kind of nice to have this kind of public square to talk about these matters. But I think one of the dangers, particularly of something like Twitter, is that it has this sort of dual identity where in one way it feels quite intimate, like you're talking with a group of friends. But actually, if a tweet blows up and gets, all these retweets, suddenly, it's in the newspapers. And I think that sometimes catches people out, and they sort of tweet something very quickly, spare the moment. And they think, well, it's just my 55 followers, and then next thing you know, it's had 5 million impressions and they're getting into professionalism issues. So I think, having that in mind, that things can blow up, and, either having your account private, etc. But I mean, there's a lot of great stuff on things like MedTwitter that I follow, but there is also just like a lot of drama and arguments. People often talking about like what's today's bin fire or whatever. I find it quite difficult. So there's been several times where I've sort of just tuned out completely, because I felt like it's just adding stress to my day that I don't really need. But I think if I was a medical student or a PhD student, and it's the same applies to me as a trainee, to be honest, you do have to be careful.
Yes, it'll be an interesting topic to see how social media goes forward in the future. As well as running Geeky Medics and being a GP trainee, you also wear an education hat, don't you, and teach medical students. Do you have any thoughts on how education might evolve and how technology might be used for medical education in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I've always had, somewhat of an interest in this. And I think, a big moment in my life was I got to there was some interview in The Guardian, I think in 2012 or something, where they asked about what's the future of medical education. And that's the only time I'll ever be quoted in The Guardian in one of these tiny little columns along with lots of other people. And I think what I'd sort of said back then was that I felt like the notion of physical presence or the value of physical presence will be called into question for a lot of context. And I was experiencing that in the final years of medical student. They started to record the lectures and you could access them on the online portal. And once I saw that, I started thinking, wow, this is what's going to happen everywhere. And getting 200 people into a single room at a single time just seems a bit crazy from many contexts. Obviously, there's a time and a place where physical presence is better than these situations. So that was my prediction back then, and it's clearly gone that way. And with COVID, that was accelerated enormously. Institutions basically having to do that, and the same happened in general practice, etc. But just on the educational side, everyone had to suddenly get confident with delivering lectures via Zoom, creating materials that could be accessed asynchronously. And some institutions and educators are probably further along in that process than others before COVID, but certainly afterwards, everyone has had to up their game and get familiar with how to do that. So face-to-face now is not the default, right? In general practice or in education. And in the past it was, remote was definitely something that occasionally might happen in very peculiar circumstances. So it's totally flipped. The question is, where do we go from here? And my suspicion is that it will just incrementally become even more like this. So as technology is improving, we're able to deliver more effective educational sessions remotely and asynchronously. So I think there's going to be more and more asynchronous teaching where resources are created and then experience is created, and then that experience can be accessed via whatever device and at whatever time the student wants. So my suspicion is that we'll go more in that direction. And then I think things like VR and AR will come in and start to erode away at some of those use cases where you think, well, of course we need a face-to-face session. There's no other way to do this well. I think slowly but surely, very narrow pieces of that will be possible in VR and will be able to be delivered remotely and, repeatedly in whatever context the student is in. So you see that at the moment there's a few companies now doing AI chatbot patients to allow people to practice communication skills. Something that, you would always generally say, well, it has to be face-to-face. And at the moment, clearly, actual humans are generally better than these chatbots. But with time, that boundary will become more blurred. And I think, practicing, say, managing an emergency in an ABCD type format, say anaphylaxis. Again, at the moment, you've got to get an expensive sim man in a room largely, and set up a whole sim suite and have all these staff there and have students allocated to come in 20-minute slots. But, several companies, again, with the Oculus headset and an app can replicate that experience and also let students continue to practice that, rather than getting your 1 10-minute slot of that scenario that the uni puts on for you. Suddenly you can do that at home over and over again and sort of hone your skills. So I think that's where I would put the next 5 years. And I'm aware that anything beyond that, I probably can't predict because the exponential nature of this stuff developing, I'm constantly surprised. Even, I feel like I live somewhat on the bleeding edge of tech and I still always underestimate what's going to happen.
That's really exciting, isn't it?
Mm.
I think it's from my work as a physician associate, I work in general practice, and there's a recognition now, like you were saying, that face-to-face isn't always the norm. And for patients, educating patients around their condition, do we have to do that individually for every patient in a face-to-face, or can we bring them together in a group? Can that be online? One more question, if I may. Geeky Medics is fantastic. and the content and the quality of the content that you produce on your website is, some of the best out there. It is noticeable that it's free to access as well. It must take up a lot of your time to produce the content. How do you balance running Geeky Medics and working and having a life around it?
Yeah, that probably is that's been the single biggest challenge probably over the last 10 years. And I think it was really difficult in the first probably 6 or 7 years because there was basically loads of work to do. It was this really awkward phase where lots of people were using it. There was really high expectations, lots of demands via email and DMs. But really there was just kind of me hurriedly trying to do things alongside, being a foundation doctor. So that was really difficult. And then I sort of, once I finished foundation, I locumed so that I could be a bit more part-time to give me a bit of time to catch up. But certainly over the last few years, once we had like the app, which I changed to a yearly subscription, which is still cheap and really has most of the content that's free on the website, but in another format, that provided like a stream of revenue that I could then use to sort of, pay people for the content, pay people to review the content. Now we have someone who leads all the editing called Chris, who's amazing, and have build this team now of amazing people that I kind of have to pinch myself that I get to work with all of these amazing people, and we get to have like a good time as we do it. As a remote team, we don't have an office or anything like that. It is way more intellectually interesting and more satisfying to have more people using it and enjoying it and getting benefit from it than it would be to say make more money but have 100th of the user base paying. That to me is just not, I don't think I would be engaged with it. Now, we offer some things that we charge money for. All of it I think is very cheaply priced, but the 80% of what we do, maybe 90%, is all free. And I quite like the idea of us being able to both produce some of the best stuff out there for clinical skills and also give it away for free. Because that just kind of levels the playing field for anyone who can't, that's probably like there's part of it in there that I like it for that reason. But yeah, the balance of doing that alongside training has been very difficult at times, and I've not always gotten it right. And it's definitely had impacts on my personal life.
Brilliant. Thank you, Lewis. I know there's something new that you've been working on for Geeky Medics and it's just launched recently. Do you want to let the listeners know about that?
Yeah, sure. So we've done OSCE stuff for a long time, but more recently we've launched our sort of OSCE station platform. So what that essentially involves is a bank of OSCE stations. We've got 600 or so now. There's one communication skills examination, interpretation, all the usual suspects. So if you wanted to do a station on, say, nausea and vomiting, you find that station and it has a patient script. So whoever's playing the patient can look at that and say, oh yeah, my tummy's been hurting for 3 days and I've had a bit of fever, etc. There's a student instructions bit, which is, the bit you get outside of an OSCE, where it says, you've got 8 minutes and you need to go in and explore this patient's nausea. And then there's an interactive examiner's checklist, which is for whoever's playing examiner, where they can sort of go through and tick all the key points that you should ideally hit and ask any additional questions, etc., etc. So essentially, these little ready-made kits for you to practice OSCEs with friends or colleagues. And so that's one thing. And there's a few for free, and then you can sort of pay for the rest. But separate from that, to build these OSCE stations, we had to create software to allow us to write them and develop them. So we ended up creating this sort of OSCE station creator software by necessity more than anything else. But because we created it, we've just been able to offer that for free now, because I thought what we've created actually is, I don't think there's anything else out there that's close. So you can basically go on, create, however many stations you want, and it does it all very nicely. You can add your patient instructions, student instructions. You can even use our checklist templates and then tweak them to whatever works for your university. And then you can even sort of say, oh, let's do a group practice session on my circuit of 6 stations that I've got. Share a QR code out to 2 other people. They scan it. You assign them their role. So you say, you're your student, your examiner, I'll be patient. And then it just sort of all does it on the platform and they get their relevant information. So it's really cool. Definitely check it out. If you just go on geekyquiz.com, you'll see the OSCE stations option in the left-hand menu. But yeah, because it's cool and fun, that's really what I'd like people to check out. And if you're thinking about running a practice OSCE for friends, you could use that quite easily. And again, it's completely free. There's no catch or anything there. It's all free.
Brilliant. Lewis, thank you so much. And I salute you for all your hard work that you've put in and the philosophy that you have in running Geeky Medics and helping countless healthcare professional students over years. I'm sure it will continue to grow and continue to be a success in the future.
Well, thanks, James. And thanks so much for having me on the podcast. You're doing amazing work. Keep it up. It's something I enjoy listening to be in the loop on the PA side of things, because sadly don't have any PAs working with me at the moment. So it's the way that I stay in touch.
Oh, that's very kind. Thank you. I'm sure most people will have heard of Geeky Medics, but do you want to give a shout out of how people can find Geeky Medics and how they can get in touch if they've got any questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find Geeky Medics at geekymedics.com. And if you have any questions or, anything really, you can email me. So I'm just Lewis, Lews, at geekymedics.com. And I will get back to you. There may be a slight delay, but I will definitely get back to you at some point. And if anyone is interested in the OSCE station stuff, as I said, all of that creation stuff and whatnot is free, so no need to purchase and no pressure. But if you wanted access to that 600 station bank as well, on top of that, then I've got a podcast code for you today, which is PA podcast. So if you add that promotional code in at the checkout, you'll get 20% off if you're interested.
Amazing. Thank you, Lewis. That's brilliant. And I'm sure lots of PAs and lots of listeners will take you up on that. It's definitely a good service to get involved with. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. And thanks to you for listening as well. I hope that you found it really interesting to hear from Lewis about how he set up Geeky Medics and how that idea that he had as a medical student at university has flourished into one of the biggest and best medical education resources out there now across the globe. If you've got an interesting idea for another episode of the PA podcast, if you're a physician associate or another connected healthcare professional, I'd be delighted to hear from you. I'm on social media at PA Podcast UK, and I hope you'll join me again for the next episode.
Thanks for listening to the Physician Associate Podcast.